The door had been locked for 63 years. Thomas Harper stood in the dim corridor of Windsor Castle, his hand trembling against the cold brass handle. He was 84 years old now. His uniform hung a little loose on his frame, but his eyes were sharp, and his memory was sharper. He remembered the last time anyone had opened this door. It was 1962. He was a young royal guard then. He was barely 21. Queen Elizabeth II had walked these halls with quiet grace, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. And she had stopped right here, at this very door. She had looked at him with an expression he would never forget. "Thomas," she had said softly, "no one enters this room. Not ever. Do you understand?" He had nodded. He had sworn an oath, and for 63 years he had kept it. Now, the palace staff was preparing for renovations. They wanted to catalog every room, every corner, every hidden space in the castle. They had sent him a letter. They needed access. They needed the key. Thomas had not replied. Instead, he had come here himself. One last time, the hallway was empty. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Dust hung in the air like tiny stars. Thomas pulled a small brass key from his coat pocket. It was tarnished with age, but it still fit perfectly into the lock. He hesitated. His hand was still on the handle. His heart was pounding in his chest. He thought about the promise he had made all those years ago. He thought about the Queen's face, the sadness in her eyes, the weight of whatever secret lay beyond this door. If you're here with me right now, watching this unfold, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about loyalty, duty, and the hidden life of royalty. Thomas turned the key. The lock clicked. The sound was loud in the silence. He pushed the door open slowly, and it groaned on old hinges. A rush of stale air escaped from inside, cold and musty. He stepped forward into the darkness. The room was smaller than he expected. The curtains were drawn, thick and heavy, blocking out all light. Thomas fumbled for a moment, then found a lamp on a small table near the door. He switched it on. The light revealed everything. The room was untouched, frozen in time. A single chair sat in the center, facing a wall covered in photographs. Dozens of them. Maybe 100. All in black and white. All carefully pinned in neat rows. Thomas moved closer, his breath shallow. The photographs were of people. Soldiers, young men in uniform. Their faces serious, their eyes staring out from the past. Beneath each photo was a small handwritten note. Names, dates, places, Thomas. He recognized some of the names. They were men who had died in the war. Men who had served. Men who had been forgotten by history, but not by the Queen. And then he saw it. In the corner of the room, on a small desk, was a leather journal. It was worn and faded, the edges frayed from years of handling. Thomas walked over and picked it up carefully. He opened the cover. The first page was written in elegant handwriting, "Those who gave everything, and for the debt I can never repay." It was signed simply, Elizabeth. Thomas felt his throat tighten. His hands shook as he turned the pages. Each entry was dated. Each one told a story. A name, a sacrifice, a promise. And then, near the middle of the journal, he saw a photograph that made his blood run cold. It was a young man, no older than 20. He wore the uniform of a royal guard. He stood at attention, his face calm and proud. Thomas knew that face. He had seen it every day for the past 63 years. In the mirror, Thomas stared at the photograph, his mind racing. It was him. Younger, stronger, standing in full ceremonial dress. But the date written beneath the photo made no sense. December 14th, 1962. That was the day he had first been assigned to this corridor. The day the Queen had given him the key. The day she had made him promise to guard this door. But why was his photograph here, among the faces of the dead? His hands trembled as he set the journal down. He looked around the room again, seeing it with new eyes. The photographs on the wall. The names, the dates. This was not just a memorial. This was something else. Something personal. Something the Queen had carried in silence for decades. Thomas turned back to the journal and kept reading. The entries were detailed. Each one described a moment of sacrifice. A soldier who had thrown himself on a grenade to save his unit. A pilot who had stayed with his burning plane to avoid crashing into a village. A medic who had died shielding wounded men from enemy fire, and then he found his own entry. His breath caught in his throat. December 14th, 1962. The man who saved my life and chose a lifetime of silence over recognition. Thomas closed his eyes. The memory came flooding back. It had been a cold winter evening. The Queen was scheduled to attend a private event in the castle's east wing. Security was tight, but not tight enough. Thomas had been on patrol, walking the outer corridors, when he noticed something wrong. A man in maintenance clothing was moving too quickly, too purposefully. His eyes were focused, his movements sharp. Thomas had seen that look before, during his brief service in the military. It was the look of someone with a mission. Thomas had followed him. The man had slipped into the service passages, the hidden arteries of the castle that most people never saw. Thomas had stayed close, his heart pounding, his instincts screaming that something was about to happen. The man had stopped at a junction. He had pulled something from his bag, a pistol. Small, compact, deadly. Thomas had not hesitated. He had rushed forward, tackling the man before he could react. They had struggled in the narrow passage, bodies crashing against the stone walls. The gun had fallen to the floor. Thomas had pinned the man down, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Palace security had arrived moments later. They had taken the man away. Thomas had given his statement. And then, late that night, the Queen had come to see him. She had been alone. No guards, no attendants. Just her, standing in the doorway of the small guard room where Thomas was waiting. "You saved my life today," she had said quietly. Thomas had stood at attention. "I was doing my duty, Your Majesty." She had looked at him for a long moment. "If this becomes public, it will cause panic. People will lose faith in our security, in our stability. The man you stopped was not part of a larger plot. He was alone, disturbed, but the newspapers will not care about the truth. They will create fear." Thomas had nodded. He understood. "I need this to remain secret," she had continued. "For the good of the country, for the safety of my family. Can I trust you with that?" "Yes, Your Majesty." She had smiled then, a small, sad smile. "You are giving up recognition, medals, honor, a story you could tell your children. You are choosing silence." "It is my duty," Thomas had said again, and she had given him the key. "There is a room," she had told him, "a place where I keep the memory of those who have sacrificed for the crown, those who will never be celebrated publicly, but who deserve to be remembered. You will guard that room. No one else will know, but I will know, and that will have to be enough." Thomas had taken the key. He had made the promise, and he had never broken it. Now, standing in that same room 63 years later, Thomas felt tears on his cheeks. He wiped them away quickly, as if the Queen might still be watching. He looked at the photographs on the wall again. All these men, all these stories, all this quiet sacrifice is hidden away from the world. And then he noticed something he had missed before. There was an empty space on the wall, a gap among the photographs. A pin was already in place, waiting. Thomas turned back to the desk. Beside the journal was a sealed envelope. His name was written on it in the same elegant handwriting. He picked it up slowly. His fingers traced the letters of his name. He broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was brief. "Thomas, if you are reading this, I am gone. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your silence. The world may never know what you did, but I will never forget. Inside this room, you will find one final task. Complete it, and your oath will be fulfilled. Elizabeth R." Thomas looked around the room, his heart pounding. What task? What was she asking him to do? Thomas read the letter again, searching for clues. One final task. He set the letter down and looked around the room more carefully. The photographs, the journal, the desk. Everything seemed to be exactly as the Queen had left it. But there had to be something else. Something he was meant to find. He moved along the wall, studying each photograph, each face, each name. Some of the men had died in combat. Others had died in accidents while serving the crown. A few had died saving others. Their heroism documented in the Queen's careful handwriting. And then Thomas noticed a pattern. Some of the photographs had small red dots in the corner. Tiny marks barely visible unless you were looking closely. He counted them. 12 photographs. 12 red dots. Thomas pulled the journal back open and flipped through the pages, looking for the corresponding entries. Each of the 12 men had something in common. They had all left behind families, children, wives, mothers, who had never known the full truth of how their sons had died. The Queen had written notes about each family, where they lived, what had happened to them over the years. Some had struggled financially. Others had moved away, trying to escape the pain of their loss. And at the end of each entry, the Queen had written the same thing: debt unpaid. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He understood now. The Queen had been tracking these families for decades, watching over them from a distance. But she had never been able to help them publicly. To do so would have revealed the secrets these men had died to protect. So she had waited, and now she was asking Thomas to finish what she had started. He turned back to the desk and opened the drawers, searching for more information. In the bottom drawer, he found a stack of envelopes. 12 of them. Each one was addressed to a different family. Each one was sealed with the royal crest. Thomas picked up the first envelope. It was heavy, substantial. He held it up to the light and could see the outline of documents inside. He did not open it. That was not his place. But he understood what they were. Letters from the Queen, explanations, apologies, recognition for sacrifices that had been hidden for decades, and likely financial support, trusts, provisions, the kind of help that would change lives. Thomas sat down in the chair, envelopes in his lap. This was the task. Deliver these letters. Make sure the families received what they were owed. Give them the truth, even if it came 60 years too late. But there was a problem. Some of these families might not exist anymore. People moved. People passed away. Decades had gone by. How was he supposed to find them? Thomas looked back at the journal. The Queen had anticipated this. Each entry included updated information, addresses, names of children and grandchildren. She had kept track of every family. Even as the years passed, she had never stopped watching over them. Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The weight of this responsibility. The trust the Queen had placed in him. She could have asked anyone to do this. She could have left instructions with her solicitors, her staff, her family. But she had chosen him, the man who had saved her life, the man who had kept her secret. Thomas carefully placed the envelopes back in the drawer and stood up. He needed a plan. He needed to think this through. Delivering 12 letters to 12 families spread across the country would take time, energy, resources. He was 84 years old. He did not have much of any of those things left, but he had made a promise, and he would keep it. Thomas walked back to the wall of photographs and looked at his own image. Again, young, strong, proud. That man had been willing to give up recognition for duty. That man had been willing to stand guard over a locked door for 63 years. Surely, that same man could deliver 12 letters. He took a photograph from his pocket. It was recent, taken just a few weeks ago at a small ceremony honoring retired palace staff. Thomas looked older in this photo, tired, but his eyes were still sharp. He pinned the photograph to the wall. In the empty space that had been waiting, his duty was almost complete. But not yet. Thomas left the room, locked the door behind him. He pocketed the key and walked down the corridor, his steps slow but steady. He had work to do, families to find, letters to deliver, and a promise to keep. As he reached the end of the hallway, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a young palace staff member approaching. The man was holding a clipboard, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Harper, we've been looking for you. The renovation team needs access to the sealed room. They said you have the key." Thomas looked at the young man for a long moment. Then he smiled. "I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding," Thomas said calmly. "That room is not part of the renovation plan. It is under permanent protection. Royal orders." The staff member frowned. "But sir, we have no record of that." "The plans clearly show then the plans are wrong," Thomas interrupted gently. "Check with the senior administration. They will confirm it." The young man hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. I will look into it." He walked away, and Thomas let out a slow breath that would buy him time. A few days, maybe a week, enough to begin his task. He walked out of the castle and into the crisp afternoon air. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds. Rain was coming. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and started walking toward the train station. He had 12 families to find, and the first one lived 300 miles away. Asterisk. The train rattled north through the countryside. Thomas sat by the window, the sealed envelope resting on his lap. Outside, fields of brown and green blurred past. Villages appeared and disappeared. The sky grew darker as evening approached. He had memorized the first entry in the journal, James Mitchell. Died February 3, 1968. Bomb disposal expert. He had defused a device planted in the palace gardens during a state visit. The bomb had detonated while he was working on it. He had absorbed the blast, saving dozens of lives. The official report had called it an accidental explosion during routine maintenance. No one had known the truth. James had left behind a wife and a daughter. The wife had passed away in 1995, but the daughter was still alive. Her name was Margaret. She was 62 years old now. She lived in a small town in Yorkshire, in the same house where she had grown up. Thomas had called ahead. He had not explained who he was or why he was coming. He had simply said that he had information about her father. Information she deserved to know. She had agreed to meet him. The train pulled into the station just after 7 in the evening. Thomas stepped onto the platform, his joints stiff from sitting. The air was cold and damp. He could smell rain on the wind. He took a taxi to the address. The driver was chatty, asking questions about where Thomas was from, what brought him to town. Thomas answered politely but offered little. His mind was elsewhere. The house was small and neat, with a tidy garden and white curtains in the windows. Warm light glowed from inside. Thomas paid the driver and walked slowly up the front path. He rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately. A woman stood there, her gray hair pulled back, her face kind but cautious. She looked at Thomas, taking in his age, his formal coat, the way he stood with military straightness despite his years. "Oh, Mr. Harper," she asked, double quotes. "Yes, Margaret." She nodded and stepped aside. "Please, come in." The inside of the house was warm and inviting. Photographs lined the walls. Family pictures, children, grandchildren, a lifetime of memories, Margaret. Led him to a small sitting room and offered him tea. Thomas accepted. They sat across from each other, the envelope still in Thomas's hand. "You said you have information about my father," Margaret said quietly. Her voice was steady, but Thomas could hear the emotion underneath. "I was only 6 when he died. I barely remember him." Thomas nodded. "I know, and I am sorry for that." He placed the envelope on the table between them. "This is from Queen Elizabeth," he said. "She passed away recently, as you know. But before she died, she left instructions. There are things about your father's death that were never made public. Things she wanted you to know." Margaret stared at the envelope, her hands folded in her lap. "What things?" she whispered. "Your father was a hero," Thomas said. "He died saving lives. Many lives. But the circumstances had to remain secret for reasons of national security. The Queen knew what he had done. She honored him privately, and she wanted to make sure you knew the truth." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She reached for the envelope with shaking hands, then stopped. I always felt like there was something, she said. Something they were not telling us. My mother used to say the same thing. She would get so angry sometimes because no one would explain what happened. They just said it was an accident. A tragic accident. It was not an accident, Thomas said gently. It was a choice. Your father chose to put himself in harm's way to protect others, and the Queen never forgot that. Margaret opened the envelope carefully. Inside were several documents. A letter from the Queen, handwritten. A detailed account of what had happened that day in February 1968. Photographs of James receiving a private commendation, and a bank document showing a trust that had been established in Margaret's name. Margaret read through everything, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she looked up at Thomas. Why now? She asked. Why wait all these years? Because the Queen could not reveal it while she was alive, Thomas said. To do so would have put others at risk. But she never stopped thinking about your father, or about you. She made sure you were watched over, even from a distance. Margaret wiped her eyes. I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything, Thomas replied. Your father's sacrifice meant something. It still means something. The Queen wanted you to know that. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of decades settling between them. Finally, Margaret spoke. Will you tell me about him? About what he was like? Thomas hesitated. I never met your father, but I knew men like him. Men who put duty above everything else. Men who understood that some things are worth dying for. He paused, then added quietly, men who were braver than most of us could ever hope to be. Margaret nodded, clutching the letter to her chest. Thomas stood slowly. I should go. But if you have questions, if you need anything, there is a contact number in the documents. People who can help you. Margaret stood as well. She crossed the room and hugged Thomas tightly. He was surprised, but he returned the embrace, his old arms gentle around her shoulders. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for bringing this to me. Thomas left the house and walked back into the cold night. The rain had started, light but steady. He pulled up his collar and began walking toward the town center, where he would find a hotel for the night. 1 letter delivered. 11 more to go. But as he walked through the rain, Thomas felt something he had not felt in a long time. Purpose. The Queen had given him one final mission, and he would see it through to the end, even if it took everything he had left. Back at the house, Margaret sat by the window, the letter in her hands. She read it again, her father's story finally complete after all these years. And in the quiet of that small room, she whispered a thank you to a Queen who had never forgotten. 3 weeks had passed. Thomas sat in a small cafe in Edinburgh, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea. His body ached. The travel was taking its toll. His knees hurt. His back was stiff. Every morning it took longer to get out of bed, but he had delivered 8 letters now, 8 families. 8 stories of sacrifice finally brought to light. Each meeting had been different. Some families had cried. Others had sat in stunned silence. One elderly mother, 94 years old, had simply nodded as if she had known all along. I always knew my boy was special, she had said. I always knew. Thomas had 4 letters left. He pulled out the journal and checked the next entry. Robert Sullivan. Died August 12, 1971. Royal Protection Officer. He had intercepted an armed intruder during a private family gathering. He had been shot twice, but had held the attacker until backup arrived. The official story had been a hunting. Accident on private grounds. Robert had left behind a son, Daniel Sullivan. He was 58 years old now, living in Edinburgh. He worked as a teacher. According to the Queen's notes, he had spent his whole life wondering about his father's death. Never quite believing the official explanation Thomas had called him 2 days ago, Daniel had sounded skeptical on the phone, cautious, but he had agreed to meet. The cafe door opened. He was tall, with graying hair and glasses. He looked around, spotted Thomas, and walked over Mr. Harper. Thomas stood slowly and shook his hand. Daniel. Thank you for meeting me. Daniel ordered coffee. He studied Thomas carefully, his teacher's eyes sharp and analytical. "So," Daniel said, "you have information about my father." Thomas placed the envelope on the table. "Your father died protecting the royal family," Thomas said simply. "He was shot by an intruder. He saved lives. But the incident was covered up to avoid public panic." Daniel stared at the envelope. He did not touch it. "I knew it," he said quietly. "I have always known something was wrong with the story." "A hunting accident?" "My father hated hunting. He never went near guns unless it was for work." "The Queen wanted you to know the truth," Thomas said. "She carried the memory of your father for decades. This letter is from her. It explains everything." Daniel picked up the envelope slowly. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. "Why did she wait so long?" he asked. "Why not tell us when it happened?" Thomas had been asked this question before. He had thought about it carefully, because telling the truth then would have caused more harm, he said. It would have exposed security weaknesses. It would have put other people at risk. Your father understood that. He chose to be silent in death, just as he was in life.
Ow.
Daniel opened the envelope and began reading. Thomas sat quietly, giving him space. He watched the emotions move across Daniel's face. Shock, grief, pride, anger, relief. When Daniel finished, he set the papers down and took off his glasses. He rubbed his eyes. "My mother died thinking he was careless," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "She died thinking he had thrown his life away in some stupid accident." Thomas felt the weight of that pain. "I am sorry," he said. Daniel shook his head. "It is not your fault. You are just the messenger." He paused. "But it is hard." Knowing she never got to know this, they sat in silence for a long time. The cafe buzzed with life around them. People laughed. Conversations flowed. Life continued, unaware of the grief and healing happening at this small table. Finally, Daniel looked up. "Are there others? Other families like mine?" "Yes," Thomas said. "I have delivered 8 letters so far. I have 4 more to go, and you are doing this alone." Thomas nodded. Daniel frowned. "You are what, 80? 85. 84. And you are traveling around the country by yourself, delivering these letters?" "Yes." "Why?" Thomas considered the question. He thought about the locked room, the promise he had made, the oath he had sworn. "'Cause the Queen asked me to," he said simply. "And because these families deserve the truth." Daniel studied him for a moment, then made a decision. "Let me help you," he said. Thomas blinked. "What?" "Let me help you deliver the rest," Daniel repeated. "I have time. School is on break, and my father would have done the same thing. He would have helped." Thomas started a protest, but Daniel held up his hand. "Please," Daniel said, "let me do this. For him. For all of them." Thomas looked at this man across the table, the son of a hero, someone who understood sacrifice, someone who wanted to honor his father's memory by helping others. Thomas nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Thank you." Over the next week, Thomas and Daniel traveled together. They delivered 3 more letters. A widow in Glasgow, who wept with relief. A grandson in Newcastle, who had never even known his grandfather. A sister in Manchester who had spent 50 years demanding answers that never came. Each delivery brought closure. Each story brought healing. Finally, there was 1 letter left. Thomas pulled it out on the train ride back to London. The name on the envelope made his breath catch. Sarah Harper. His own daughter. Daniel noticed his reaction. "What is it?" Thomas could not speak. He turned the envelope over, his hands shaking. Daniel leaned closer and saw the name. His eyes widened. "Your daughter?" he asked quietly. Thomas nodded. He had not understood. He had not known. But now, sitting on this train with the final envelope in his hands, the pieces came together. The Queen had not just been asking him to deliver letters to strangers. She had been asking him to tell his own family the truth. Thomas stood outside his daughter's house, the final envelope in his hand. He had not seen Sarah in 3 years. They had grown apart slowly, the way families sometimes do, Not from anger or cruelty, but from distance. From silence. From all the things left unsaid over the decades, Sarah had always asked questions about his work. About his time at the palace. About why he never talked about what he did. Why he never sought recognition. Why he seemed content to fade into the background. Thomas had never been able to answer her until now. Daniel stood beside him. "Do you want me to wait in the car?" Thomas shook his head. "No, stay please." He rang the bell. The door opened, and Sarah stood there. She was 56 now, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the years. She looked so much like her mother. The resemblance hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Dad." Sarah's surprise was clear. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Thomas said quietly. "May I come in?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She looked at Daniel with curiosity, but did not ask. They followed her inside. The house was warm. Photographs of grandchildren covered the walls. Thomas saw his own face in a few of them, older pictures from years ago. Before the distance had grown, they sat in the living room. Sarah folded her arms, her expression guarded. "What is this about?" she asked. Thomas placed the envelope on the coffee table. "This is from Queen Elizabeth," he said. "She left it for you before she died." Sarah stared at the envelope, confusion flickering across her face. "Why would the Queen leave me anything?" "Because of what I did," Thomas said. "Because of the promise I made? Because of the life I chose?" Told her everything. He told her about the day in 1962 when he had stopped an assassin. About the Queen's request for secrecy. About the locked room and the photographs in the journal. About the oath he had sworn to guard a door that no one else could open. He told her about the 63 years of silence. About turning down promotions and recognition. About the questions he could never answer, the stories he could never tell, and he told her about the letters. About the 12 families. About the final mission the Queen had given him. Sarah listened in silence, her face unreadable. When Thomas finished, she picked up the envelope with shaking hands. She opened it carefully and pulled out the letter inside. Thomas watched her read. He saw the tears form in her eyes. He saw her hand move to her mouth. He saw the moment when everything she had believed about her. Father shifted and reformed into something new. The letter was addressed to her personally in the Queen's handwriting. "Dear Sarah," it began. "Your father is one of the most honorable men I have ever known. He saved my life, and then he spent the rest of his life protecting the secret of what he had done. He gave up recognition, advancement, and the chance to be celebrated, all for the good of the crown and the country. But in doing so, he also gave up the chance to share this with you. That was my fault, not his. I asked too much of him. I asked him to carry a burden in silence, and he did it without complaint for over 60 years. I want you to know what he sacrificed. I want you to understand the kind of man your father is. He is a hero. Not because he stopped one violent man on one winter day, but because he kept his word every day after that. He chose duty over glory, silence over fame, and that is the rarest kind of courage. Please forgive him for the distance his oath created, and please be proud of him, as I have always been. Yours, sincerely, Elizabeth R. Sarah set the letter down. Tears were streaming down her face. "Dad," she whispered, "I did not know. I thought you just did not care. I thought the work mattered more than us." Thomas felt his own tears now, hot on his cheeks. "It was never that," he said, his voice breaking. "I wanted to tell you. So many times, but I had given my word." Sarah stood up and crossed the room. She knelt in front of her father and took his hands. "I am so sorry," she said. "I am sorry for the distance. I am sorry for not understanding." "You had nothing to understand," Thomas said. "I was the one who failed you. I let the oath become a wall." Sarah shook her head. "You did what you believed was right. You kept your promise. That is not failure. That is integrity." She hugged him then, and Thomas held his daughter close for the first time in years. The weight he had carried for so long began to lift. The silence that had stood between them for decades finally broke. "Daniel." watching from the corner of the room, wiped his own eyes. They sat together for hours. Thomas told Sarah stories he had never been able to share. About the palace, about the queen, about the men whose photographs hung in that locked room. Sarah listened, asking questions, laughing and crying in equal measure. Finally, as the evening grew dark, Thomas stood to leave. "There is one more thing," he said. He pulled the key from his pocket. The brass key that had hung around his neck for 63 years. "The room," he said. "Someone needs to look after it. Someone needs to make sure it stays protected. The Queen's instructions said that once the letters were delivered, I could pass the responsibility on." He held out the key to Sarah. "Will you guard it?" he asked. "Will you keep the promise?" Sarah looked at the key, then at her father. "Yes," she said. "I will." Thomas placed the key in her hand and closed her fingers around it. "Thank you," he whispered. He walked out into the night, Daniel beside him. The air was cold and clear. Stars dotted the sky above London. "You did it," Daniel said. "You completed the mission." Thomas nodded slowly. "I did. How do you feel?" Thomas thought about it. He thought about the locked room and the photographs, about the 12 families and their tears, about his daughter's forgiveness and the weight that had finally been lifted. "Free," he said simply. They walked in silence for a moment. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked. Thomas smiled. "I think I will spend time with my family. I think I will tell stories. I think I will live the rest of my life without secrets." "The Queen would have wanted that," Daniel said. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "She would have." Somewhere in Windsor Castle, in a corridor that few people walked, a locked door stood silent. Inside, photographs of heroes lined the walls. A journal recorded their sacrifices, and now a new guardian held the key. The promise had been passed on. The oath had been fulfilled. And Thomas Harper, after 63 years of silence, was finally allowed to rest. He had kept his word, and in the end, that was all that mattered.